Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Fujifilm and London Camera Exchange webinar tonight. This is both live right now, and it is also being recorded by London Camera Exchange and will be available on their platforms going forward. So welcome tonight, whether you are watching live or whether this is sometime later and you're just catching up with it. So I'm Carol, and I've worked for Fujifilm now for nearly 3 years. And I've been shooting with Fujifilm cameras for about nearly 4 years. I've been shooting with Fujifilm cameras. So I want to give a little bit of housekeeping first. So just a teeny bit before we get properly started, I'm just going to do a teeny little bit of housekeeping. So as I said, this is an introduction to creative photography, and it is with LCE and Fujifilm UK. It's a live stream. So if you have comments while this is all going on, please feel free to type your comments in the box. I will try and reply to some of them, as long as I'm not flooded with questions. I will try to answer them live during the show. We do also have Pete from London Camera Exchange, who is sitting in the background, and he can also answer some things, particularly around the kit and prices and availability, things like that. So this should go on for not longer than about an hour, hopefully. If we get all through it much quicker, then we'll all say bye-bye before that. If it goes on much longer, particularly if the question's very interesting, then we'll let it go on a little bit longer as well. But other than that, I anticipate finishing about 8 o'clock. If there's any major problems, then we'll put some comments up on the in any format we can. I'm not anticipating any problems though. Okay, so let's do a little teeny bit about who I am. As I said, I'm Carol from Fujifilm UK, and I've been with the company for nearly 3 years. But I've been a photographer for a great deal longer than that. I first started taking photos. I come from a family that was obsessed with photography. And I started taking it seriously in my teens and early 20s, and got completely hooked as an amateur. But in my 30s and 40s, I began to take it very seriously, and actually did a degree in photography and digital imaging and started to run my own business. So I was a freelancer for a very long time. But in that time, I was using a mix of straight photography, beautifully composed, interesting photography, but also in the mix, some slightly different things as well. And this particular photograph is one of my favorites. It's one of my very earliest digital photographs, and ironically was taken on a Fujifilm. It was taken on a Fujifilm 602 bridge camera. Now, what's unusual about this photograph is the fact that on a bridge camera, I was hand holding, all right, I was leaning against something and doing a long exposure in a corporate environment. In fact, I was being interviewed for, auditioned for a role with a company shooting event photography for government. And this particular photo was the photo for them that made the difference between them hiring me and not. And out of this one photograph, I got 10 to 15 years of really good work from this company. So what is creative photography? It's a term that's bandied around so much, and I'm going to only cover a particular part of it today. We are all creative people, but our photography can be used in many different ways. Some of us are landscape photographers who want everything to be beautifully composed, sharp. We need things to be, the depth of field to be correct, the exposure to be correct. Some people are architectural photographers, needing everything to be beautifully lined up. Some are portrait photographers. Very often we get locked in a set of rules that we use to make our photography conform to what we need it to do. And when I'm working, and when I was working as a professional photographer, definitely, there were a lot of the time my images were sharp, beautifully composed. But actually, there's a world in which we can use our cameras quite differently. And this is where we can free up our creativity and start to show the world in a slightly different way. So I call it was a very pretentious thing, but seeing beyond. And I use that term in my head when I'm trying to show something different about a photograph. So, or a scene I'm seeing. So for me, the sort of creative photography we're going to talk about today, and I'll come on to the different types in a second that we're going to talk about, can be anything. It can just be a different angle or an unexpected way of seeing. We're going to go a little beyond that today, but for me, it shows a new or a different perspective. We all know that we've been in many, many places where everybody has taken the same photograph. So finding something new. What it's not, though, is just stuff that doesn't fit anywhere else. And this I've seen happen a bit in camera clubs and things like that, where people, or online, in forums and on Facebook groups, where people will put up something that is just out of focus or is wobbly, and then there's no real intentional story behind it. So it isn't that it is not landscape or not architecture or not portraiture. It's a thing in its own right. So it's usually, for me, when I do it, it is tends to be non-representational or literal. So a landscape will look less like a landscape. But it is really difficult to do well. I'm going to show you some examples, and I'm going to talk a bit later about how we can use the cameras to make this happen. A lot of what I am going to talk about today is about doing this primarily in camera. There is absolutely nothing wrong with things that are generated in Photoshop. And I do particularly Lightroom editing, particularly for color afterwards. And I'll explain that as I go through. But if I show you some photos now. So this is a lovely, and also some of these photos are with Fujifilm cameras. Some of them way predate. Some of these are 20 years old. Some of these are 15 years old. They're taken on a variety of cameras. And this process has got much easier, and I'll explain a little bit about that a little bit later with newer cameras. So the photo on the left is a really lovely photo of a dogwood called Eternal Flame. And it's a lovely photograph taken in winter. The colours are good. It's nicely exposed. It's a plant in a garden. But I wanted to show something quite different about that. I get obsessed with colour. So colour, although later on you'll see some black and white ones. Colour has always been my thing, and I see very strongly in colour. So I like to make things that will represent something that I know what it was, but shows something different. And this is an absolutely classic example of that. This is using one of the creative techniques we're going to talk about called intentional camera movement. Now that has become very fashionable and is sometimes not done justice to. But I'll talk a little bit later about some of the techniques I use where to make intentional camera movement make sense and done well. So this is an example of intentional camera movement. I've put the different settings underneath. The next one is an example of a long exposure. And a long exposure and talking about, this is a very, 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 very well-known view. And like the rest of the known universe, I had to photograph it. And it's not a particularly, even now, it's not a particularly different photograph. There's just a very subtle, slight difference. And that is because this is a long exposure, but handheld. I was able to keep the building still, but just have the gentle rocking motion of the boats. I did a more elaborate one, which I actually haven't included in this presentation, but I will. It's on my Instagram feed, I think, or my Facebook feed. That shows a much more elaborate one, multiple exposure version that I did as well. But this is where I'm telling the story from within a whole set of photographs. And I just want this one. But this is the one I'm going to print to put on my wall, because it just shows it in a slightly different manner. It's long exposure, but it's also black and white. So it just has that slightly more art feeling about it in a very, very common view. This again, this is two things actually. This is intentional camera movement and using blurring. So I am intentionally defocusing the camera, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Intentionally defocusing the camera and then moving it in a diagonal direction. I am not interested at all in what this originally was. In fact, it was some flowers. It was a border of flowers. I was interested in the color and getting that representation. This has been on and off, been my background on things like my computer and my iPad and my phone at varying times. And it's had a little bit of brightening and contrast work done in Lightroom, but not very much. And this is an example of, again, another one where I have taken an original image, which is nice, and then I have done the same thing, but I have been moving the camera side to side. All of these are handheld. So I have a very bad reputation for not really liking using tripods, even when we didn't have things like image stabilization. And with intentional camera movement, as long as you know how to do it and you know how steady you are, you can create very straight ideas. So why would you do creative photography? Why would you use this in your mix? Many of us are very specific things that we like to do with our cameras. And I come across, I talk to a lot of people all the time, as many of you know. And I come across a lot of people that get very locked into a way of taking photographs and or lose their inspiration. So very much what I feel with this is that this is a tool that helps you open up your photography. It doesn't have to be done all the time. Some people make a complete lifestyle of it. And found that I've moved more and more towards a creative type of photography. But it opens up ideas. It makes you think a little differently. I find it adds flavouring to a story. I've told the world about this, but I was in Florence and Venice in February this year. And I have a stack of images, most of which are a combination of street photography, lovely ordinary tourist photography, some detail. And in the mix are some of these more creative ones. And they just give, like putting salt and pepper on a meal. They just give it a little extra. It gives boredom a kick up the backside. I've been doing this a very long time, and and part of the reason I become much more use creativity much more in my photography is that I get bored, and I can shoot to a brief, no problem. But this helps me to break out of photographer's block. And I think we've all experienced this, where we go out for the day and we go, there's nothing really here that interests me. The sky's dull. It's a bit rainy. It's cold. There's nothing here. But actually, with some of the creative tools we're going to talk about, we're talking about, it actually really can make an enormous difference to the way that you take your photographs and what you achieve. Did I say it's difficult to do well? Yeah, practice, playing. It makes you play. It makes you play with the camera. It makes you play with the scene. I usually take a standard shot first. I pretty much always take a standard shot first. And then I will start to play. So when I was doing a lot of freelance work, that was known as the safety shot. So I would take the safety shot and then I mess around. It uses the camera in ways that you might not normally ever do. If you're a landscape photographer or a sports photographer, you might never, you might always be up at 1,000th of a second. So this uses it in a different way, and it just helps you to look at the world differently. I've found that since I've started doing much more of this, that I look for things to do this with. And mirrorless and Fujifilm cameras in particular, now this is going to be obviously centered around Fujifilm, but actually the principles here I've been using since film cameras. But mirrorless cameras make this so much easier. And Fujifilm, I found that my Fujifilm cameras really help me to create this much more quickly, simply, and with much less guesswork. One of that is the fact that just simply because it's mirrorless, you can see what's happening before you ever take the shot. So I quite often, particularly with intentional camera movement, will practice my movement up and down, round, all sorts of things before I have ever taken the shot. So I get the practice in, I can see it happening before I've photographed it. Image stabilization makes a phenomenal difference, particularly to my long exposures. I love long exposures. Multiple exposure mode, which builds your image in the camera, but also keeps your raw files, your separate images that you've taken as their separate raw files, so that you can take them into Photoshop, Lightroom, Capture One, your weapon of choice, and mess around with them in there as well. I choose not to. I went to look for examples and found that I've usually, I have always deleted my raw files. Film simulations. And we'll come a bit more to this because actually when you use some of the tools in here, you can use film simulations within those tools as well. And particularly the T series and the X100 series cameras, the dials on top, I find the tactile nature of playing with the dials. I've actually got a couple of them here. So actually playing with the dials here and being able to think through the process of my shutter speed and my aperture and think that through physically on the top really helps my thought process. But I've also shot these on things like the XM5, but also the GFX, the 100 S2. I've done a couple of multiple exposures on there, and that's been really, really useful as well. 100 megapixel files, so you use them carefully, but it's still very easy to do. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions come up, so if I'm just double checking where I'm at and how I'm doing. Cool. If you do have questions, pop them up. If you do have things that you want to know about the cameras, then London Camera Exchange can help with that. So the types of creative photography we're going to talk about today are quite specific. Creative photography is such a broad church, everything from tiny details onwards. But we're going to talk about 4, and I've got examples of all of them, 4 specific types. And then at the end of that, I'm going to talk about how I use those things to combine in one form. So let's talk quickly about long exposure. I've done long exposure work for as long as I can remember. I think we've all played with long exposure work from time to time. What I have really found, though, is that since I've had image stabilization, it has just changed my world. Most of these are half a second, possibly a second. I have one image which I haven't got on here because it really didn't show on here because it's quite small, where I had a 4-second exposure. I sometimes show that on workshops and things that I'm doing. It's not the best photo in the universe, but it does show that you can handhold 4 seconds if you really want to. So weirdly, when I was going through this, I noticed that my long exposures, on the whole, I tend to make in black and white. This actually, that bike is bright pink. This is in York. And you can see here that it's on the XT5, it's with the 1655. It's all very standard. And I was doing a photo walk. I've got a very similar one that I took in Edinburgh. This is, again, the beauty of long exposure and being able to handhold a camera. This is not a Fujifilm. This predates my Fujifilm. But a really good example of what happens when you're trying to tell a story. And this is one of those high-flying, I don't know what you call it. Well, they call it a flying machines. Lots of people whizzing around up there. But I wanted, so the combination of the size of it, the height of it, and that movement, capturing that movement was what was really important to me. This is a very old photo. This is my second oldest photo in here. This was taken in 2005 and is the first time a Segway was shown off to British police as a way of deciding whether they wanted to use it. And this is actually a long exposure with a flash to freeze action. It's a technique I rarely use nowadays because I rarely use flash, but actually was a really good way of combining the long exposure with the fast burst of the flash. And again, this was an actual working example. They use images, and this image and others in their publicity campaigns and things for quite a long time. These were used. So that was long exposure. I'm going to talk about how we set these up in a minute, but I want to show you what I'm talking about. So on from long exposure is the one that's developed quite a reputation at the moment, intentional movement. Now here, I'm going to concentrate on intentional movement of the camera. And I'm going to concentrate on intentional movement where you have some control over it. There is another version called camera tossing, which I don't have an example of here because I couldn't find them earlier. But I once had a small exhibition of these where I throw the camera in the air and move it at the same time, throw it and then catch it again. The key is to catch it. And it creates wonderful shapes. But intentional camera movement is a way of using your camera to give a completely different look to an image. Now, again, here, I was not at all concerned about what this image represented. I do this because I am an absolutely useless painter and artist, but I have pretensions to be a painter. And I cannot do it. I just can't make my fingers and my hands coordinate with my eyes and my brain. But I discovered quite a long time ago that the type of art that I love, I could replicate, I could make in camera. Again, one of my most common ways to do this is with plants because they have such a variety of color. And actually, this is autumn colors, I think, with something like a gentian in the middle. And all I've done here is I'm moving the camera in a shape and a way to just create blended lines like this. And then in Lightroom, all I've done is I've brightened it up a bit because it usually will come out quite dark. This one I've actually sold in the past. This is part of a series of them I did, and this was sold to hotels, and for a nice little fee. And it goes on the wall in a hotel. I've never seen it. I'm assuming it's never gone to a hotel in the UK. I've been in a few. And it's a beach, obviously. It's actually a beach in Norfolk. But what I wanted to get was that sense of the size and the scale and the bands of colour. Again, with intentional camera movement, it doesn't just have to be side to side or like that. It can be little tiny movements. This is a tiny movement. So the Ferris wheel, or whatever it's called, is going round and round and round. It's moving in its own place. And I am then making a tiny movement like that at the same time. Now, in the bit that's still at the bottom, that shows as a circle. In the bit that's moving already, it shows as arcs. And it produces something that's really quite different from what you saw originally. The next one is really important because we're going to come back to this, and we're going to come back to this in terms of everything else that we're doing. So this is a multiple exposure. Now, as I said, I'm a failed artist. I would give anything to be able to draw this sort of thing, or paint this sort of thing, but I can't. It's just beyond my abilities. I have lots, it's not that. So this actually is a multiple exposure using a number of techniques, and we're going to come back to those techniques. But this is using textures that I'm photographing at the same time to cause this slightly ethereal look and this faded look. Now, this one is done entirely in camera. There's been no work to it done afterwards. Obviously, I'd let those roses go, and you can see I never changed the water. I did notice that afterwards. But it creates this lovely soft image when you use multiple images that are very close together with different focuses. So, but this one is also a multiple exposure and couldn't be more different. It is complete chaos. And that's because between each image, I'm keeping the balloon in the middle as close to centered as I can. And then in each of the 9 images, between each of the 9 images, I'm turning the camera each time. And oh, something very strange happened then. And each time I do that, I am just creating this slightly changed image while keeping a central focus point. Also with this one, it's difficult to see in here, but I was stepping forward between each image. And this is a technique I use quite a lot to create a sort of a tunnel effect all coming into the one item. Again, what I'm mostly interested here is nodding to the place where I am, which is Chinatown, Covent Garden, but wanting to mostly show the colour and the sense of the place, as opposed to actually just showing the balloon in the middle of the lanterns, the larger lantern in the middle of the lower lanterns. And again, I've used a very similar technique here. This is Florence, and I was wanting to get a sense of how hectic and busy it was. Even though it's February and the carnival is over, it's still really busy. Now, it might be quite difficult for you to see here in this size of image, but I've kept at the very center, about 2/3, on the third in the center, that you'll see that Florence, the Duomo of Florence in there. And each image I've taken, I've tried to keep that as my center point, but I am stepping forward each time to get a slightly different perspective. Now, this one actually incorporates some things we're going to talk about later as well, in that this one has some in focus and out of focus images as well. So I combine, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Still no questions. Ooh, that's good. So blur, out of focus. Out of focus images, with my out of focus images, they tend to be around lights and lighting. I've always been obsessed with lighting, fairy lights, lighting of any kind, and the colors of lighting. One of my favorite things is my fiber optic lamp, which I've photographed quite a lot in the past. And this isn't that. This is actually a building in Carlisle. And I took some nice straight images of it. But by just making it out of focus and letting it completely blur, I can create something different. Now, I took several versions of this, and there's also a movement one, but which isn't on here. But I wanted to just show that. Similarly here, often when I'm representing something, I will do it completely out of focus. And this is 2 versions of my Christmas tree many years ago. The one on the left is using an old vintage lens, but the one on the right, I've put a piece of cardboard in front of that vintage lens with tiny cutout star in the middle that I've cut out very tiny amount, stuck that in front of the lens and photographed through it. And what I'm trying to get is the shape and the color. So I'm not seeing any questions coming out of that so far, but that's fine, because I'm going to now talk about how we can use, particularly in Fujifilm cameras, but also in other mirrorless cameras, how I combine all of those techniques to create something quite different. And I will just, there we go. So with Fujifilm cameras, I can use multiple exposure to combine and the other techniques to combine together to create an image in camera which is quite different from what I'm seeing. Fujifilm cameras do this very well. They have multiple exposure. We're going to talk about how to actually set up multiple exposure in a minute. But in multiple exposure, I have up to 9 exposures that I can use. If you're on a much older Fujifilm camera, I think from X-T2 backwards, you may only have 2 exposures. That doesn't stop you doing any of this. It just puts a little more constraint on. So I always, when I'm doing any kind of creative photography like this with things like blur or intentional camera movement or long exposure and multiple exposure, I almost inevitably work in manual focus. That's because I often don't want it in focus. I often don't want it sharp. So there's no point in the camera trying to focus on something, particularly in a multiple exposure, because I want absolute control over where it's going to go. Similarly, in an intentional camera movement, it can get itself quite confused if I'm moving the camera while it's trying to focus. So I'm always in manual focus. I tend to combine blur, movement, aperture changes, film simulations, and sharp images to make a totally different image. But the key thing is when I'm shooting, and this is one of the key things about freeing up your mind when you're doing this, is that this is definitely one of those techniques where I look first, shoot second. Quite a lot of my photography world, I'm a really fast shooter, and I'm composing and I'm shooting all the time. This really slows me down. So here, when I'm shooting this sort of photography, any one of these techniques, I have in my mind an idea of what it is I'm trying to achieve. Now that takes some practice, and it takes knowing your camera as well, understanding how different lenses work when you swing them around, knowing how different film simulations work, knowing how the different settings in multiple exposure work, and we'll come back to that. So it's really crucial that I have an idea of what I'm trying to achieve. So here are some examples of these combined images. So this is just a street in Liverpool. When I saw this street, I noticed that it had really strong architectural verticals and horizontals. It's a really okay, ordinary street. So what I did is that I knew that I wanted to make something more interesting from that image. Oh, James Taylor's just come up with a really good question. So which is your favorite technique? Oh, what day of the week is it? That's a really good question. All of these ones that I'm telling you are my favorites. Of those, at the moment, I've got really involved with this multiple exposure and combining it with intentional camera movement, which is what this one is. So thank you to James. That's a really great question. So this is using multiple exposure, just two exposures in dark blend mode. And I'm going to explain what dark blend mode is in a minute. But I've combined that with very strong, very careful, horizontal and vertical. Let's get a camera. There's one with a lens. There we go. Oops. So very careful horizontal and very careful vertical moving of the camera. So when you move the camera, it's very much about the speed you move it at and the time of your exposure and the length of your lens as to how exaggerated that horizontal and vertical or any movement will be. So this combined, what I saw was the shapes and what I saw was the color. So that color green, the bits of blue, the bits of red. There is very little done to this image in Lightroom. There's just a bit of contrast added. So this technique conforms into all sorts of things, but this is using the same technique, but this time, this is much more like the roses. So here I'm combining multiple exposure in 9 images. And over that 9 images, I am building a lot of texture. This is on my XE4. This is in the last 10 minutes of our workshop in Glencoe that Fujifilm ran last year, year before last. And I'm using my XE4 and we're all packing up to go in the cars. And this little clump of trees, it's a miserable day. There is cloud that's forgotten to get off the ground. There's a bit of snow on the ground. The mountains can't really be seen. They're just hinted at in the background. So this is the classic place where I want to do a multiple exposure. So I start with one like this, where I'm building. This is 9 images. I start by shooting texture, something like the floor. So I shot the floor. I shot some really out of focus ones of the trees. I shot a close-up of some of the grass. And then I shot 3 or 4 of the trees at varying level of sharpness. Then I've done a completely sharp one. And finally, another layer, which is the snow on the ground, which was behind me, which was much more ordinary snow. All of those combined, I was using a film simulation at the time, which was Classic Chrome. And then in Lightroom, all I've done is I've warmed that up slightly more, so that again, it gives that very impressionistic view. But the colors of what I see are the highlands. The mood is that misty, moody feeling. And I would happily put that on my wall. And it was 5 minutes work, probably. I had a couple of goes at it and a couple of ones that didn't work. And that's what I was saying about practicing and playing. But this one was the one that worked. Right, Chris has come up with a question. What's your go-to setup at the moment? Yeah. I imagine working for Fujifilm, you have the luxury of different cameras and lenses. Yes. But what combination do you grab most? That's a fascinating question. XT4 was my absolute go-to. XT4 was what brought me into the system. And XT5 replaced it as soon as it came out because it was just brilliant. XT4 I owned. XT5 I have via work. I sold my XT4, and the camera that I pick up most, and the camera, because the problem with working for Fujifilm is that I have all these cameras. Oh dear, what a problem. And actually that can really, really cause me a problem when I'm going out for myself, because I will go out, I will go to go out and I go, what am I going to take? What am I going to take? So I have a personal XE4, not image stabilized, 26 megapixels, with the 27mm lens on it. That's exactly what this was taken on, and a lot of my stuff is taken on that. So my absolute daily carry go-to camera for me is my XE4, but that's slightly being replaced at the moment by the little XM5 because it's so tiny. If I need image stabilization, or I know I'm going to be somewhere image stabilization, it's definitely XT5 for me. I'm definitely the more traditional side of this, and I absolutely love it. I used the X106 while I was out in Florence and Venice. I was very lucky to have one. And it was I took some fantastic photography with that, but I prefer to change my lenses. So having the XE or the XT is my go-to. Slightly long answer, but I hope that helps with that. Carrying on with this a little bit. Okay, this is using, so again, this is dark blend, but I've set the camera. This is entirely in camera. This is actually Matthew Street in Liverpool, but it's nothing to do with the fact that it's Matthew Street in Liverpool. I was just going for artsy. So I love square and at-cross film simulation. When I'm doing street photography, which I do a lot of, that's my go-to. So it's actually a little, I've got it as a little custom on my XE4 and on my XT5. And so I often have it in that. So I thought, oh, why don't I have a go with a multiple exposure in that mode? Let's see what happens. So this is dark blend, and I'm just going for shape. And yes, I did this multiple times and lots of them was dreadful, but this one really, really went, oh, hello, I'm keeping that. It makes me think of those slightly weird 1960s, I am that old, 60s and 70s artwork that you used to see on walls. But it shows that you can combine, so this is combining 2 exposures. This is combining in dark blend with intentional camera movement, with Fujifilm's fantastic, absolutely amazing camera film simulations. And this one is at-cross. And the fact that I can change the aspect ratio. So I did it in square. So I shot it in square. The raws from that would have been, I could have brought them in and they would have shown in black and white, or I would have seen them as the original color. I don't know what I did with those. I probably deleted them. And this one, funnily enough, we were just mentioning the XM5. So this is absolutely classic. This was XM5 in Cardiff just before Christmas. And this, it was absolutely pelting with rain. Don't tell Fujifilm UK that I took this camera out in the pelting rain. It isn't weather resistant, but that's what pockets and coats are for. So this is the XM5, again with my trusty 27mm. I absolutely love that lens. This is 9 images again, and again it's using exactly the same technique as I did with the bushes, the trees. This is using the technique of building up layers, but this is light blend. So dark blend prioritizes the darkest parts of the image and blends those, shows you those. Light blend blends the lightest parts of the images and prioritizes those. Average blend averages it all out. Additive blend I've never found a proper use for, but some people love it. It gives a really punchy version, but I tend not to use that. So this is 9 images again. It's built up over time, and in fact I am walking steps down between each images, but the first one is a background. No, first one's the floor, second one is massively out of focus. Each time I'm stepping forward, and that's why you get those halos around the lights and things like that, because I'm stepping forward and I'm focusing and defocusing. So this one is a combination of my feet, different exposures. It's taken in nostalgic neg, hence that warmth of colour. And I am just trying to create that sense of wet, cold, nostalgic Christmases. Some people said it looks like I was drunk. I promise I wasn't. But the XM5 is fantastic for this. It doesn't have a viewfinder. That doesn't bother me for this. It doesn't have image stabilization. Again, that doesn't bother me for this. On average, it's the exposure number here is a bit weird because it wasn't all 1/8 of a second. One of them might have been an 1/8 of a second. I think the final exposure has shown me the slowest exposure. So how do you actually make this happen? So I've got a couple of little videos here, but I always set my camera to record JPEG and RAW. That means that I have a finished JPEG, which will show me at the end, but I also have all of the RAW files that made up each of those images. Now they're quite useful, either if you want to do something different in Lightroom or Photoshop or Capture One, or if you want to actually, in fact, one of the images in that last one I've used as a standalone image because it's actually quite a nice image. Most Fujifilm cameras after about X-T3 can do 9 exposures, and all of them can do change the shutters and apertures and things like that. Multiple exposure can usually be found on the drive dial or in the camera menu. X-T5, you need to go into the camera menu because it doesn't have a drive dial or a drive button. But all of the other cameras, I'm going to show you a little video in a minute about what I actually do to set up. Choosing the type of multiple exposure is the biggest decision you'll make. And in the early days, I often did several, one in average, one in light, one in dark. But I've come to know now, if I want a painterly image, I will use average. If I want a really punchy image, I might use an additive. That just basically adds to the exposure each time. If I'm working in the dark, I'll almost certainly use light. If I'm wanting to make a really architectural or strong image, I'll tend to use dark. So I set manual focus. As I said before, there is no point in using autofocus for this. This is dead generally. And I generally work in manual exposure. But if you're less experienced around exposures, then shutter priority works really, really well. And I usually set my ISO, but I have been known to forget and have my ISO on auto all the way through. I wouldn't possibly admit to that. You'll see when we actually do this in a second, I'm about to swap images. But when you're actually shooting, you can decide whether you want to keep the image or try again. And I'll show you that in the second video. So I'm just going to add to the stage now. I'm just going to show you a little quick video, and I'll try to talk through this at the same time, showing you how I set up for multiple exposure and where I go to do that. So there's no sound, so I will talk over this. Hopefully this will work. So this is the drive menu, and you can get to it from the drive button here or from the camera menu in the main menu. And in here, you've got that little symbol with multiple exposure. Choose the one you want. And then when you go to look at the symbol, you'll see a little tiny in the bottom left-hand corner, 0 of 9 or 0 of whatever. And it's actually always 0 of 9. And that little symbol which crosses over 2 images. So that is the symbol that you are now in multiple exposure mode. When you actually go to shoot, this is what it looks like. And it can feel really strange when you do this. So this has started halfway through. Let's go back to the beginning. So when you're going to shoot, now this is my very, very boring setup that I might have done in a bit of a hurry this morning, sorry. But it shows you how this actually works. Sorry about the little wobble. So when you take a photo, you take your first photograph. Now, if this was a big scene, I'd be looking at this and I'd have a look at it. And then I would either move forward or move around. So when you like an image, you press OK. Now, can you see that when you start your next image, your original image is ghosted over the top of it? So now I can take that image, decide if I like it or not. That's all right. If I like it, I press OK. There we go. So now I can move forward, move back, move around, turn it on its side, do whatever I like, and I can take my next image. Now, my first image might have been the floor. My next image might be the whole scene properly shot. So each time I do this, I go through and then I press OK when I'm happy. And then I take the next shot. So the next one I'm about to take, so I forgot to press OK there. Now I've moved it, and I've moved it into a position I'm not really, so there, I put it there. So now this might be me deciding to put another layer on, and it might be a layer too far, and that's quite common. So I quite often will take that last layer off, and if I don't like it, you can just press either the toggle to go backwards or the back on the dials, the little back symbol, and go back. And then and that lets me retry. When I finish them all, I can then exit by pressing the display back button. And that gives me the image. And there's the final JPEG. So when you're playing, you get lots of opportunity to see how it's looking. All the way through that, I can change things like the aperture, the shutter speed. I can change the focus. I can change actually the color if I wanted to, the film simulation. I think I can even change the white balance. So if I wanted to do something really funky around different white balance colors, I could. And that would work really well with something like light blend or dark blend. So there's lots of ways to play with this. I'm just going to put this back up here. Where would I use these? Well, I mean, I put it so flavoring in a larger project, as I said before. They make great pieces of wall art. There's one that a number of people, I didn't have actually put it in this presentation, but I did another one of Covent Garden that several people have asked me for as a print. I might not have actually got round to doing it yet, but they've asked. I sometimes make series of these, or I have an ongoing project about lights. They're great if you're an amateur and you're entering camera club competitions or any competition. They are really good. And the London Camera Exchange Photographer of the Year, I think, has just finished. But actually, they have a creative photography genre. And this works really well in here. Always check the rules. Check the rules to make sure you're putting it in the right place and that you're following their rules, that you can submit originals. Now, obviously, it generates in camera as a JPEG. So if the competition insists on raw files, then you're going to have to talk to them about that. But they're really good places to put to use. So we are pretty much at the end. It's like I planned this. What I want people to do with this is to go out and play. We often, I think all of us as photographers can sometimes take what we do very seriously. And there are very definite times when I'm photographing a wedding, I'm going to take it seriously. Now, I've never done a multiple exposure to wedding. But I have done a lot of other creative things with wedding photography, but I'm following a brief. There are times when this is appropriate and there's times not. But it's the middle of winter, it's horrible weather. But actually, this lends itself to those sorts of conditions. It doesn't have to be out and about. It can be a still life, like I did the roses. Enjoy it. You try it over and over and over again. This is not fast and it is not simple, but it is something to just keep niggling away at and playing with and being delighted with. That's the thing I like to do. I like to be delighted. I like to be delighted, but I like to be delighted with my photography. Enjoy it. Enjoy the process. Enjoy the messing around. Enjoy using bits of the camera that you don't ever normally use. And Fujifilm is full of that. Lots of things that you can do. Don't be afraid to edit afterwards. Now, 90% of the images, about 90% of the images you saw tonight had little or no processing done to them. The ones that I tend to do much more processing to are the intentional camera movements, because by definition, it's hard to get color saturation in there because of the nature of the way you're doing it. So I am very unafraid to mess with those. And some of those, the ones I haven't seen here, but you'll see some on my Instagram and my Facebook page, where they are unrecognizable from the original content. But that's because I'm not trying to take a photo. I'm trying to get over the fact that I can't paint. And I want to show what I saw. Above all, I want you to have fun with this. It's a fantastic extra thing you can do in your photography. For some, it might lead to something completely amazing. But for most people, it's a part of your photography and it's very freeing. I am doing some photo walks with London Camera Exchange over the next few months with individual stores, and I will either be running them as creative workshops or as photo walks in which I will talk about this as well. So if you're part of London Camera Exchange, if you generally go to like London Camera Exchange's website and you're buying from there, don't be afraid to go in and come and see me at one of these photo walks. They're usually about an hour and a half to 2 hours. They don't go far because we don't get very far because we're playing with cameras. I usually have kit with me, and they're a great resource for actually asking some of the questions that you might think of after on here. I've answered the questions. Oh, thanks, Chris. Great photos, Carol. Thank you. And Michelle, thank you. Thank you for the advice and inspiration. Thank you. If you do have questions, my details are here. This is my work email account. As many people know, I'm on the road all the time. I'm out at events a lot. So I may not always answer straight away, but I will try and come back to you with questions. If you have questions either about the technical side of this, if you have questions about buying cameras and things, it's definitely worth talking to London Camera Exchange, and the guys and girls there can help you out. I have a Facebook and Instagram for my Fujifilm account, which are a little neglected. But one of my many things I said I would do for 2025 is to try and put more on there. So I will try and put some more on there, but keep a little eye, and it's another way you can get hold of me as well. So we are at 59 minutes and 35 seconds. Well, thank you everybody that's come on today. And if you're watching this afterwards, feel free to come back over it. Feel free to contact me and feel free to talk to London Camera Exchange. And hopefully see you for real in a London Camera Exchange soon. Thanks. Bye.